You're watching Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum's latest show, devoted to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm very happy to be joined today, as ever, by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and our special guest, Francis Foster, comedian and co-host with Konstantin Kisin of the Triggernometry podcast. Now, thank you for coming on, Francis. Recently, the alleged comedian, Romesh Ranganathan, maybe that's a little bit unfair, but he did a comedy session in which he was pushing Sadiq Khan's anti-sexual harassment. You're familiar with the Say Mate to a Mate campaign?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yes. I find it very interesting. Number one, a couple of things. I think Romesh is actually a very good comic. Yes. And I knew Romesh from back on the day of the circuit, and I've always liked him. I think he's a nice bloke. I think that this Say Mate to a Mate campaign is absolutely demented, because what it does is it conflates two particular issues, which is off-collar language or banter, or whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
And then they conflate it with things like sexual assault or harassment of women. And obviously those things are completely different. And as always, the most beautiful aspect of all of this was the internet, in particular Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. Thanks, Elon. It was the memes, and like for instance, you saw somebody chasing a woman around with a knife, and in the back there was a bloke with a placard that just said "mate."
Yeah. Well, it's bizarre to me, this whole campaign. I mean, if you had to guess just off the top of your head, how much money do you think they spent on this whole thing?
Oh, millions.
Millions.
Probably millions, yeah, absolutely.
To do absolutely what besides virtue signal? Like, you could have put that millions into a shelter, you could have hired more police, you could have done something actually tangible in the real world, but instead it's like now, like, the most ambitious thing that we can do for any sort of social problem is like a media circuit, is like some sort of like advertising campaign. Nobody's willing to actually do anything practical in the real world.
Well, this is it. The most important thing in life nowadays is not actually to be good, it's to look good.
Exactly.
And that cuts right the way through. It cuts right the way through the left. And actually, it cuts right the way through the right. And we see it with the right, where they talk a good game about immigration, and then, Suella Braverman will get wheeled out to say sometimes quite inflammatory things which don't help public discourse, whilst achieving slightly less than fuck all to deal with the problem.
Yes.
And then they just come out with ideas even more demented than the last. So first it was Rwanda, then they're going to send them to Ascension Island, which doesn't even have the infrastructure.
Hang on, what is this? Ascension Island?
Ascension Island. It's an island.
It's in the South Atlantic. It's a British overseas possession.
Yeah, exactly. And they're talking about sending them over there.
But the irony of that is that apparently, I don't know whether this is true, but I've read that it's true. Not only would you need to build the infrastructure to house the asylum refugees, you need to build infrastructure for the builders who would need to build the infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's a pretty self-defeating plan. It would be incredibly expensive, and it would only address a fraction of the problem in the first place. So it's one of the ways in which public relations. But politics and public relations become conflated with one another. It doesn't become results-based anymore. But as a comedian, Francis, I mean, you must be particularly dismayed by the fact that not only has comedy become so politicized, but so radically unconcerned with making people laugh. Because when Romesh Ranganathan was doing that set, and he's a friend, he can be a good comic at times. My comment at the beginning was probably a little bit unfair. But it was clear, you panned her faces in the audience. These people were puzzled.
Yeah.
Like, why have I come to a comedy set where I'm being lectured at and school-marmed rather than entertained? And it was incredibly frigid atmosphere in the room. And what's wrong with the incentive structure in comedy that even very good comics fall into that trap? Okay,
so a couple of things. So what they actually did with that clip, there were some jokes in there which the person then edited out in order to make it look worse, so that it would go viral, number one. Number two, I think I would agree, even Romesh would agree that wasn't his strongest material. So let's be honest about that. But number three, it's, the problem is when you identify certain events or moments like Romesh doing the mate thing, when actually the problem is systemic, and I'm going to sound very lefty when I say that, but it is systemic within comedy. So I think it was in 2018, the director of the Edinburgh Festival, or the head of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe Awards, the Comedy Awards, her name was Nika Burns. In 2018, she did a speech where she said she was looking forward to the new woke era of comedians.
Jesus.
where comedians are deciding not to be funny, but to decide what is and what isn't acceptable. Now, I didn't realise that that was my job as a comedian, to be a glorified clipboard wanker moderator, to turn up at people's gigs and go, no, no, yes, yes. It's because the role of the comedian is in many ways, and actually in the truest semblance of what we're talking about here, to be an agent of chaos. It is a job of a comedian to be a disruptor, to challenge the status quo, whatever the status quo is, to subvert what people think and what people feel, and also to expose the truth. And in many ways, that's why Trump was so successful in 2016, and not enough people have actually said this, is because Trump is actually a stand-up comedian.
Oh yeah, 100%. I've been saying this for years.
Yeah.
Nobody can touch him. He's the best. He's like a riverboat casino captain. Nobody knows how to deal with him, even remotely. And I think too, you see people like DeSantis now going out and saying like we're gonna like slit people's throats. You see Vivek kind of aping it a little bit. You don't really see it in the UK.
No.
But you see people trying to copy his style, and nobody can do it because they are politicians.
Yes.
And they should never have let him in onto a debate stage if they ever wanted to win. He's got perfect timing.
He's got perfect timing. He's naturally funny. He doesn't care.
He does not care.
He does not care, which
Solitary,
is in
yes.
itself a superpower. I remember when we interviewed Bill Burr on Triggernometry, one of my all-time comedy heroes, and he actually said that he only really started to get good at comedy when he was 41, and he stopped caring. It's that superpower as a comedian that you can harness, where if you genuinely don't care what people think, you're going to be so much funnier. And that's what Trump has. And he just went into the primaries and he had a nickname for everyone, which immediately made them look stupid, which immediately lowered their status and humiliated them. What does every politician want to do? They want to be taken seriously. And if you've got a bloke with basically a blonde wig and an orange face calling you a dickhead, and you've got no response to it because it's never happened to you, you're not going to look serious.
He didn't even call them a dickhead. Like, what did he say to Ted Cruz? He was like, yeah, well, your father like shot JFK.
And he takes the wind out of people's sails. I mean, like, let's say that Ted Cruz has had a history of making less than flattering remarks about women, and Megyn Kelly was holding Ted Cruz to account on that. Ted Cruz would have tried to compete with Megyn Kelly on that terrain, whereas Trump just went, only Rosie O'Donnell. Only Rosie. Perfect timing, completely won over the audience. And then all of a sudden, Megyn Kelly was on the back foot when she had a list of completely incriminating statements that Trump had made about women. It didn't matter because he completely shifts the rules of debate precisely because he makes them comedic rather than intellectual. And
I just want to point out as well that I'm not a fan of Trump, and I actually think that he toxifies the debate, and he's not a helpful person to have, particularly when America's in this febrile state where you're actually wondering what's going to happen on a societal level when there is such disharmony between both sides.
I think it's fair to say that Trump is more of a symptom of America's ailments than the solution to them. People on the left, or people who, radical anti-Trumpers on the left at least, will say that he's the cause of America's ills. That's not true either, but he's not the solution.
It's interesting that nobody ever really learned from 2020. Like, they thought, like, Trump didn't get in, Joe Biden gets 81 million votes, Trump's out, and that, like, all of this would just go away overnight. And it's like, guys, you're still living in a country that like half the population supports them. They didn't go anywhere. They didn't sort of like turn to dust like at the end of like a Marvel movie when you take out like the big bad guy.
They wanted them to.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just fascinating to me that like this is a lesson that seems to be like unlearnable in a certain amount of our political discourse. I think too, like you had it with Brexit too, where it's like, even though Brexit obviously passed and the referendum passed, people still thought like, now that, kind of on the flip side, Brexit's done and all the kind of remainers, I guess, will just kind of quiet down and shut up. It's like, no, they're gonna fight for this until the day they die. It's too entrenched into their political outlook and into their kind of sense of who they are. If they're in this kind of Westminster intellectual circuit, they stake their claim on it.
Of course, and this is what these people don't realise. So I voted Remain. And it was through Triggernometry where we were talking to people who voted Brexit. My mother is a woman of colour from Latin America, Venezuela, first generation immigrant, blah, blah, blah. My dad is a white working class bloke from the northwest of England, Wigan. And they both voted Brexit. And I know, because I was in the comedy industry at that time, a very hyper-liberal, very progressive, very whatever word you want to use to describe it. And I just remember just being force-fed this narrative of these people are stupid, ignorant and racist, and going, well, that doesn't really tally with my experience of my father, because it's one thing to be progressive and, hey, isn't everybody the same racially? And it's a very different thing to marry a first-generation immigrant from Venezuela in the 1970s in England, when no one knew what Venezuela is or was. And as a result of that, I'm looking at my dad going, well, you're not ignorant, you're not stupid, you're not racist, you're actually a very smart, very decent man who I respect immensely. So what else is going on here? And I remember talking to my dad, and my dad's reason was for voting Brexit was because he didn't like foreigners. No, I'm joking. It's because he just didn't, he said what the EU's ultimate plan is to be a federation of states, the European Federation, and that's not what I want. When I voted for the EU, I voted to join what was called the Common Market in 1972. That's what I voted for, to join the Common Market. And now it's metamorphosized into something else, which I personally don't agree with, and nor do I feel comfortable with. And the problem in America and the problem in the UK is that people just can't understand this. Because our societies are now so fragmented, they're now so fractured, that people live in the same country whilst living completely different lives. To the point where we just can't understand everybody else's individual realities or existences. That's why one of the arguments about that the woke put forward that I've got a little bit of sympathy for is lived experience. And you go, well, yeah, because if you went to an incredibly wealthy private school and you have lived in the nice parts of London, and your life has been wonderful, you're not going to understand what it's like to grow up in a council estate in Middlesbrough, with no work and with no dad, and every day being a struggle, and seeing generation of unemployment because of globalization and deindustrialization. They're not going to get it. You just can't get it unless you physically go and live it. And that's a real problem. It's because we're just more fractured, and as a result of that, we have less and less connection with people who we share our nation with, and we just dehumanize them.
To what extent can comedy actually do us a real service in that sense? Because you talk about how we occupy the same territory, we share a country, but we share completely different moral universes and different experiences as well, which you brought in at the end there, particularly to do with socioeconomic divisions and that sort of thing. Comedy would once have acted as a very good way of soothing all of that, I suppose, because if everyone can laugh at everyone else and we can all laugh at each other, that underscores our equality in a way which is actually quite counterintuitive. The left parts of the left don't seem to understand that. When I can't remember who it was, but there was an American comedian who talked about how what I do is I pick on everyone in the audience. So there'll be a gay person in the front row, there'll be a straight white waspish person in this row, the black person here, the Latino person there, and I take the mickey out of everyone, and everyone goes home feeling equal. That was certainly my experience at university as well, of mixing with people from different backgrounds. We would take the mickey out of each other, and some of that would have a slight, a bit of interethnic banter. It can actually bring people together. But why do you think that so many portions of the left, and I think you're a dissident liberal yourself, a dissident leftist yourself, don't understand that important function which comedy can perform? It's
because what happens is, I always say that a lot of this progressivism that we see, or whatever you want to call it, is the monetization of white guilt. That's what it is. And not just white guilt, because and the reason as well that working class white people hate wokeism and progressivism is because they don't have privilege, but of white middle class guilt. And so they're guilty because, objectively speaking, they've had a great life. They've had a great life. They have had all the fruits of living in a society which is still very class-based in this country, going to a great school, growing up in a lovely area. And then there's guilt associated with that because they realise that they've had it easy. So then someone comes along and goes, hey, look, you've had it really easy. You need to make amends for it. And so what then happens is this kind of paternalism kicks in, where it's just like, I have got to protect every single person that there is. And actually, in many ways, that's racist. Black people don't need you to protect them. There's a lot of black people who are smarter than you, who are better than you, who are living lives way more successful than you. They don't need you to speak up for them.
They're not defenseless children.
Yeah, exactly. But it comes from a good place, but it comes from a place of guilt and feeling that they should do something because they're in possession of this privilege. And as a result of that, what has happened is that we just now feel unable to communicate because everybody is terrified, because the worst thing you can be is transphobic or racist or prejudiced or all of these things. But what we don't understand and what we're failing to understand is that context matters. There is such a thing as irony. There is such a thing as taking the piss. For instance, in the UK, one of the things that we do as men, if we like someone, we take the piss out of them.
Massively.
Yeah.
We take the piss out. One of my best mates growing up was Muslim. I've got Jewish relatives. He used to say some of the most horrible anti-Semitic stuff to me, literally day in and day out.
But what did you say? What did you say?
Give us some examples.
I mean, he wasn't a comedian, so he was,
Some of it fell quite flat.
Some of it felt quite. I mean, it was just funny. Like I'd walk. He runs a kebab shop, of course he does. I'd walk in, and he'd go, "Look, there he is. There's the Jew, right?" And then all these people would turn around and stare at me. And this isn't a very, nice part of Parsons Green, so they didn't know what to say. Yeah. I'd order a pork kebab. He'd tell me to fuck off, and that was
great.
That was great. Yeah. And there's love, and he's one of my best friends. Everybody go to the Kebab Kid in Parsons Green. Genuinely one of the best kebab shops in the world.
That's about as good as community relations get. That.
Yeah.
That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the utopia.
Because that's love. That's love. That's going, look, I understand you. I love you. I respect you, and we are going to have this relationship where we're going to say awful, outrageous things to one another, but it's not meant. It's not based with hate. It's with love. And we've just lost that. We've lost that.
Do you think that a reason why that's kind of been that nuance has been sort of eradicated and leveled out, and also too, I think probably why, I'm assuming you get called conservative. Actually,
all the time.
Fairly often. Yeah. Do you think that this could be because the right wing, quote unquote, or even just the center, right? Anyone who wants to be kind of heterodox is now kind of the underdog, whereas like the left is kind of the overclass. And so comedy is always kind of punching up, I would say. Good comedy. You should never punch down, right? And picking apart the kind of the left wing edifice, even if it's from like a maybe to the right, but still on the left position, just looking at it from pure political terms, is seen as like a sort of like an existential threat against something that's kind of fragile and starting to crumble around us. So when Dave Chappelle goes out and makes jokes about the alphabet people, like he did on those Netflix specials, he then has to go out like 2 specials later and do like a 30-minute kind of monologue about his trans friend to be like, no, I'm actually like in supportive of a lot of this, but you have to let me make fun of you.
Did he do that? In semi-apologetic tones?
I wouldn't say it was apologetic at all, but I would say it was, he was adding that contextualization in. It was actually a very nice story that he told.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the problem is there's also a historical element to this. So I grew up in England, in London in the 1980s. My mother wanted to call me Francisco Jaime. My dad was worried about racism, so he called me Francis, which is wonderful because it's wonderful going to a South London comprehensive with the name of a middle-class white woman. But bearing that
my great aunt is called Frances.
Yes, exactly.
It fits. I get what you mean.
So we have come a long way in terms of race, in terms of the way that we treat women, in the way we treat gay people. Gay people went through a horrendous time in this country, particularly in the 1980s with the AIDS crisis, the way they were demonised, the way they were spoken about. You had newspapers like The Sun openly saying that they're disgusting and vile and whatever else. People of colour were beaten up regularly. There were organisations like the National Front, things that don't exist anymore. So this is all in the past. Of course, there's still elements of it today, but it's nowhere near what it used to be. And I think there's still a lot of guilt with the realisation that there's been aspects of that we mishandled, that we should have done better, that we should have done more. But what is that has meant in 2023 is that there has been this overreach now, because we're so terrified that somehow we're going to go back to the bad old days of the 70s and the 80s of the skinhead and the National Front, that what these people are trying to do is trying to keep everything safe and put all of these boundaries in place so that it's never going to happen. And the reality is, it's a completely futile attempt in order to control culture, because in many ways culture is uncontrollable. Life is uncontrollable.
Maybe this partly explains why comedy is. I wouldn't necessarily say that comedy is becoming more of a right-wing thing, but but like good comedy
is getting coded as right-wing.
It's getting coded as right-wing, certainly, but it's always been dissident. But because, as Evan says, there is a new establishment in town. You know, whereas Monty Python would take the mickey out of men on wearing bowler hats and playing cricket, now the one you mentioned earlier, the meme culture has sort of has flourished on the right far more than it has on the left, and I think that has something to do with the fact that. Exactly this. The left, again, parts of the left are very keen to defend and reinforce and fortify this moral victory they think they've won, and they don't want to be dragged back in that way. And so their creeping authoritarianism is to that extent justified, and they also tend to prefer, and this is one of the reasons why I think the left struggles to meme in the way that the right is very successful at it, is because the left prefers high-minded fantasy to irreverent truths, precisely because they see themselves as the guardian of a world that they have brought into being and that they want to progress further.
I actually disagree with that. I think the left is way better at memeing than the right, but we don't recognize the memes because we think memes are like image macros, where it's like, you know, like Ben Shapiro destroys with like facts and logic. But Black Lives Matter is a left-wing meme.
Of course. I mean, comedic memes. I mean, making people laugh. I know. BLM's pretty humorless.
It's worth pointing that out. Like, say their name. That's a left-wing meme. You know,
oh my gosh,
trans kids will kill themselves. Like all these little sound bites that are
trans rights are human rights.
Exactly.
Trans genocide
ripped apart. You know, in comedically, these are all extremely effective left-wing memes that have been deployed in across, you know, America, Canada, UK. Across the entire Western world, very rapidly. Like just the fact that I'm seeing, you know, articles about like women requests her ex-boyfriend return her testicles, which is absurd. But it's like that's something that's like seriously published these days. Whereas like if you were to read that, you know, 10 years ago, this would be like in some like tabloid newspaper next to like articles about Bigfoot and UFO sightings, right? And now it's front page news.
Yeah, no, they're certainly good at memeing in that large universal sense of what memeing is. I mean, they're absolutely brilliant at sloganizing, like far better than the right. These things go viral, Instagram hashtags, all that sort of thing. But they don't use memeing as a way of fomenting, like being an agent of chaos.
Yeah,
they're trying to, you know, protect what they regard as a just moral order, which has been won, which needs to be improved further. And any kind of backsliding is just, you know, means the return of the skinheads. It means, you know, backsliding into some kind of, you know, racist authoritarianism from the right.
And the problem is as well is that the words left and right, as you've no doubt spoken about, have become largely meaningless. And what we're really talking about now is, you know, authoritarianism. We're talking about a progressive mindset, which actually, although it emanated from the left, has, I would argue, very little to do with the left now, in the same way that a cancerous tumour has very little to do with the body that it lives in. It's entirely parasitic, and it will ultimately destroy that and kill that body. But the issue is, so what was I going to say? So we're talking about the cancerous tumour, blah, 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 and we were talking about
comedy as an agent of chaos.
Right, okay. The problem is with the left is that they're utterly in fear of their own side. They're completely terrified of their own side. They're terrified of being cancelled. They're terrified of their own team calling them out and calling them transphobic. They're terrified of being essentially kicked out of the group and just being put out into the wilderness. And the reason is because the left has this obsession with purity. It always has done. You put 6 left-wing people in a room, I'll give it about half an hour before they're all at each other's throats, saying you're not really left-wing, but you're Tory.
Insufficient enthusiasm.
Yeah, exactly. And the problem is that They're terrified of each other. And then when it comes into comedy, comedy comes from freedom, the ability to be free, the ability to actually say what you think and feel, which is why the first thing that a dictator does when they get into power is stamp out all the comedy.
Right.
So as a result of that, the left is censoring its own comedians. And what happens with Triggernometry is, I interview like a gender critical feminist, for instance, who, and that's just another word for lesbian, right? And then I get a load of lesbian comedians in my DMs going, I love this interview, but they won't say it publicly.
No, it's very sad.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because, and in a way, we can then sit here and then we can just point the finger and go, oh, but they're cowards, blah, blah, blah. But it's easy for someone like me to say it, or someone like us to say it, when, you think to yourself, well, I'm in this industry, I've worked 30 years to get to the top. I'm actually, for the first 15 years, I didn't earn any money. Now I am. I may have kids. I may live in a nice house. I may have a mortgage. What, I'm going to jeopardize all of that by a tweet? It's a very big thing to ask people.
Why did you and Konstantin make that jump then? I mean, we can maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Did it require risk taking on your part to become more public? I know you didn't come out as a conservative, so to speak, but you certainly came out as someone willing to say that the emperor has no clothes to people on the left.
Because I have a complete and fundamental inability to shut my mouth.
Many such cases.
And I think that's what it comes down to. I just can't. I remember, we had Graham Linehan on, and he made a joke about a lesbian magazine, which is essentially for trans women, and he called it a lesbian magazine for men, right?
Okay.
And then they ended up getting in my DMs, threatening to sue, blah, blah, blah. And I told my girlfriend about it, and she was like, when are you ever going to learn to shut your mouth?
Yeah.
And it's just because I can't. I don't want to live in a world where I can't say what I think, what I feel, because that is a form of torture. You see all of these people, and we talk about depression, and we talk about misery, and we talk about this crisis in mental health. Of course, you're going to have a crisis in mental health. You're not being authentic.
Yeah.
If you want a beautiful cure for depression, that one person who makes your life a misery day in, day out, if you told them to fuck off, I guarantee you would feel a lot better. Now, there would be a whole host of repercussions down the line.
Spiraling consequences.
Spiraling consequences. But I'm telling you, that is a portal to a better world. And there's just a lot of people who feel very trapped, particularly on the left, that they can't say anything and they can't say what they think and feel because of the very, very real fear that they will have professional opportunities denied to them. And yet the irony is all of these organisations like the BBC, like the other channels, Channel 4, offering these professional opportunities, they are crumbling. So an example of this, I do a show, I think the next one is on the 21st of September. It's going to be me and Andrew Doyle. We're just doing some new material, and I always do it once a month in the smallest theatre in London. It's the Etc. Theatre, 42 seats. And it's a speakeasy gig, and I just say to comedians, come along, do whatever stuff you want, do your most controversial, your most intelligent. I do jokes about nihilism when I go out, and they love it, because it's that type of crowd. So we did the new material night. It went great, whatever. And then I went downstairs for a drink, and this lad came up to me. He was about your age, name of Elliot. And he goes to me, oh, by the way, really like Triggernometry, like what you do. But we were having a chat. He goes, you know what I do? I go, no. He goes, I work for TV. He goes, what do you think I do at TV? I go, you work in comedy? He goes, yeah. And I go, and he goes, you know those big TV shows that you always slag off, Francis? I go, yeah. He goes, I work for them.
Yes.
And he goes, and here's the interesting thing. You know those figures that we put out, which are very low, saying that how many people watch TV? I go, yeah. He goes, it's even lower than that. He goes, we are hemorrhaging advertisers because nobody's watching it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nobody's watching it. Nobody wants to get preached at. Nobody wants to get lectured to. And so what you have is these broadcasters whose control and whose relevancy is rapidly ebbing away.
Wow.
And now what they're doing is they're trying to inflate their figures in a desperate attempt to appear more relevant. Whilst the reality is, it's all crumbling.
Yeah, I mean, not to slag off the wokies too much, but I think too that a lot of the reason that why these sort of larger kind of more establishment shows, you know, like the BBC are devolving into this kind of propagandistic left-wing nonsense, is because the most talented, capable people recognize that they can do kind of like what you've done, is that you can pull out your phone, you can do a comedic video straight to Twitter and get a massive audience if you can just kind of go it on your own. Whereas if you're kind of less competent or even just less sure of yourself, you feel like you need to like kind of ensconce yourself into this organization. Whereas I think, you know, the whole paradigm has obviously been shifted with podcasting like we're doing now. Even, you know, Twitter Spaces, or just being able to go out on any sort of social media. You can create your own platform, you can create your own audience, and you can actually say what you think. You know, you don't need to rely on these sort of infrastructural institutions, but you have to have the confidence to stand up at least one time and kind of get out there.
But let's be positive for a moment, because there's a lot of time I sit with conservatives or people on the right, and there's quite a lot of doom and gloom, and I understand it, you know, particularly for young people. I really do get it. But there's a change.
Yeah.
I now go into liberal comedy clubs and do material. I remember I was doing new material, and I was diagnosed with ADHD like every single fucking comedian, and you know, and it's a real thing. It's affecting my life, but you know, I'm of a firm belief that you get dealt some good cards, you get dealt bad cards, you just get on with it, right? And I did this routine, and it went quite well, and it still needs working out, but it's very much like anti-woke. And I said the basic, one of the jokes in it is when I was saying that the way we look at history is completely ahistorical. Look at when Julius Caesar invaded this country, he said Veni Vidi Vici. He didn't say Veni Vidi Vici, pronouns he, him, ADHD, bipolar, Ukraine flag. And they laughed. And then I went, oh, and by the way, I've got ADHD. And if you've got ADHD, no one cares. Take your pills. Shut the fuck up.
Yes.
And that got a huge laugh because they know, because we're sick of it.
Yeah,
we're so bored.
People are tired of it.
I'm ADHD. So is fucking everyone, mate.
Yeah. So is every boy under 13.
Yeah.
It's
Probably being a little bit overdiagnosed. I think you definitely do have it though.
You're right.
One of the things that actually makes me really optimistic is what you guys have done with Triggernometry, creating, you know, kind of an alternative platform and institution there. And one of the questions I really wanted to ask you is, you now have like kind of a burgeoning team of people. How do you identify good young talent? Which is something that I think a lot of people trying, you know, in this space or trying to do other things outside of media really struggle with, but that you guys have done a fantastic job from what I can see from, you know, just watching the YouTube channel. Right,
I'm a huge fan of sport, in particular football. And the reason I'm a huge fan of football is because it mirrors life beautifully. For example, there was one of the greatest managers of all time in the 1960s for Liverpool was a man called Bill Shankly, and he said, simplicity is genius when referring to football. But actually, that's also true of life. If you read, you know, I try and read a lot. I try and read a lot of articles by a lot of different writers, and I've got this policy. The more ornate, the more flowery your prose, the more bullshit it is. You read something by Judith Butler, it doesn't make any sense, but you read Orwell's 1984. It's clean, it's concise, it's sharp, it's just honed to within an inch of its life. Same with writers like Truman Capote, same with Huxley. And when it comes to talent, it just stands out. It's undeniable. You just have to be open to it. And you have to be passionate about what you do. Because if you're passionate about what you do, whether it's football, whether it's comedy, whether it's political commentary, whether it's novels, doesn't matter. And you have a passion for it, if you see someone good, you get excited. You're like, I want to be around that person. Like, for example, Andrew Doyle. I love Andrew. I think he's one of the most talented satirists of his generation. I love being around him. And the reason I love being around him is because he's brilliant. And that's all you need to know.
And also super nice.
Yeah.
Genuinely nicest guy.
Yeah, he's really nice, but it's exciting to be around him. And when you're looking at talent, simplicity is genius. They don't have to dress it up. They don't have to do all the tricks and the twirls and whatever else, because there is something there innate within them that makes you feel drawn to them, whether it's a reader, whether it's an audience member, whether it's a viewer. And that's the key.
And as mainstream, and as you're saying, as mainstream organizations like the BBC, Channel 4, the typical guardians of comedy, so to speak, as those institutions cease to serve that function, and you're saying that already they're dressing up the figures a lot, you know, all the rest of it. Do you think that we're going to see there's going to be a tipping point in this world, and that we will see an even greater mass exodus of the people who relied on those sorts of institutions into the kind of podcast media space that's currently flowering? Do you see that? Do you see that coming?
Well, what I see happening is this. So we live in many ways a golden age of podcasts, where there's a proliferation of podcasts. The mainstream media is hemorrhaging viewers, they're hemorrhaging listeners, and people are going to their podcasts. And as the culture fragments, more and more podcasts cater to a very specific niche of people. So whether it's Triggernometry, whether it's Spiked, whether it's Navarra Media, whether it's here. So they're all going to their little individual corners. But eventually what is going to happen is you're going to get homogenization. Reconsolidation. Yeah. So you're going to get people on the left who are going to be like, well, actually, we've got all these great left-wing creators. Let's put them together in one group.
Yeah.
We've got all these interesting right-wing creators, but it's not going to be what happened before. So, for instance, one of the things that I find most interesting amongst the right is a kind of right-wing, kind of black pill way of looking at the world, which I find there's a comedian who I love called Nick Dixon. I used to have a podcast with.
He's great.
Yeah, he's great, and he's very, very funny, and there's a real audience for that. So it won't be long, I think, before people look at those kind of talents with those voices and go, actually, you know what? You're great, you're different, you're interesting, come in here.
I think this is already happening in America with organizations like The Blaze. Yeah. I think Tucker might end up doing something. Who else is... like the locals thing? Dave Rubin's got his fingers in a lot of pies. But I agree that the space is ripe for the UK. So why aren't you doing it?
But that is the way that the culture is going to move. And you can already see the players start to have a look. And the days of everybody having a podcast, whilst great, it's not sustainable.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. And here's the thing with being a creator. Most creators just want to create.
Yeah.
Most creators just want to create. They don't want to attend. So for instance, with Triggernometry, once we were getting it off the ground, we were getting it off the ground. We were doing 100-hour weeks. I was in meetings with Audio Boom, talking about advertising, click rates. You know, these advertisers are happy. These aren't. What can we do?
Now you outsource all
putting thumbnails together in the middle of the night.
Yeah, and you go, you know, these are all important tasks that I don't want to be doing because I just want to be creating content. And that once these platforms are up and running, I think that's gonna start happening more.
Because the temptation of what you're saying, the temptation of, well, let's just get all this together, let's cluster this together, and then we'll appoint someone to do all the boring, nuts and bolts logistics of it, and then everyone can just get on with creating whatever they create, and it's just kind of
And that works much better, because the worst thing that you can do, and from somebody who's started a company which is now successful, is put people in a job that they're not suited for.
Yeah.
It's the worst thing you can do, because somebody can be phenomenally talented, but if someone's a phenomenally talented sketch artist and you put them in the ring, you know, in an MMA ring, I mean, it's not going to work.
Sure.
So you've got, and that is really important, really important.
If I can just touch on this alternative institutions thing a bit longer, I was in Austin, where Joe Rogan is now, you know, taken over the town and become like a little king, helping to put together Big King, the Creek in the Cave, if you went there. So I helped build their bar program for a few months.
What is the Creek in the Cave?
It's a comedy club in Austin, Texas. But Joe Rogan has now, you know, built the comedy mothership in Texas. He's built like an actual brick and mortar business. And I think this is kind of the next thing for a lot of people, like potentially like yourself or other people in this, where it's like, okay, we can make the YouTube channel, we can make the Substack platform, we can get people in, you know, and there's money to be had there. But the real next step will be creating something physical, material in real life. I think Barry Weiss and kind of the Heterodox crowd have also doing that in Austin with the University of Austin. They're trying to make an actual building. Do you think that this is like a uniquely kind of American phenomenon, maybe even just a Texas, Austin phenomenon? Or do you think that there's room to do something like that in London or in the UK?
I think it's more difficult in the UK for a number of reasons. There's more space. In the States, there's less tax, which means more disposable income. I can't believe I'm saying that as someone who identified on the left. And also as well, there's the American dream, there's a can-do spirit, there's this, well, we can go out and we can achieve things. You don't really have that in the UK, where everyone's like, are you sure? Yeah, but it's going to involve a lot of work.
Kind of drives me crazy.
We poo-poo everything.
Yeah, we do. And look, but there's also upsides to that. It's why we've never had fascism.
Probably.
We've never...
Well, not yet.
Probably.
No. But this country will never have fascism, because if Hitler got on stage in the UK...
We would laugh.
We'd just go, who the fuck are you? Who's this prick? Fuck off, mate. And he'd be like, yeah. And you're like, all right, mate, look, it's 4 o'clock, it's Friday, I'm going to knock off in about 5 minutes. So, if you want to keep cracking on, you can, but I'm off down the pub.
There's a sort of deflationary, no-nonsense attitude we have.
We just don't take ourselves that seriously. We don't. Trump is not a fascist, can I just make that point? But Trump wouldn't work here. Because he'd be like, he'd come out and go, you know what, I'm the greatest. And we're like, mate, you've got a wig. No, fuck off.
Yes.
It just wouldn't work.
I don't know. Do you not think so?
Nah. No. It's just like, come on, mate. You're being a dick now.
Well, I don't know. I mean,
we'd like him as a stand-up comedian, but we wouldn't take him.
No.
We wouldn't be as happy
he
with
is
that
very
move.
uniquely American. But maybe not the man himself, but someone quite like him with kind of more British sensibilities, I think would probably go pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, but again, it would have to be very different for it to work here. It would have to be very, very different.
The comedy that the politician exhibited would have to be like ultra self-deprecating.
Super dry.
And dry, and exactly that sort of thing. And we have had very funny politicians in our history. I mean, Disraeli was considered a bit of a wisecracker at the time. But I wonder. A question I thought I'd ask you, because you identify as a dissident, leftist, and all the rest of it. What do you think conservatives can do better to make people less? Because it's interesting that a lot of people on the left seem to be, even though they leave the left a bit or they become disillusioned with the left, they don't like being called, well, you're on the right now, you're a conservative now. Why is there this allergy to being considered a conservative?
Because it's really fucking boring.
It is.
Just conservatives, look, I love you, and the young conservatives who watch this, all 6 of you, God bless you, and you're great. Just like, come on, there's a reason why liberals are the ones that create the art, because there's an openness and there's a playfulness and there's a desire to want to challenge boundaries. Well, they did used to be anyway, to challenge boundaries, to play, to have fun, to make mistakes. And the problem is with conservatism is that it's just like, we want everything to remain the same, everything has to, and that is never going to happen.
I think that there is kind of a new form of right-wingers, kind of called the dissident right, or the new right or whatever, people who you've had on, like Curtis Yarvin or Alex Kashuta would be very familiar with this space. That are kind of very artistic. Like there was just a right-wing art exhibition called The Exhibition in London. Some of the stuff there was great. There's a lot of very interesting kind of cutting-edge thought on the right, but it tends to be very far kind of outside the Overton window, even if it's kind of like in a unserious, joking way, although some of it is quite serious. But it's just not very palatable. And a real problem, and I won't name any names here for right-wing organizations I've talked to, is that even with money, people, talent, opportunity, they don't see any necessity to fund right-wing art or to put together like just a night for young people that's actually fun and not some like sort of boring Tory tweety social, like something actually interesting. And so they're failing to capture any sort of vitalism, really. They just don't see the importance of it. Whereas, I think it's like the Tony Blair Institute that Unheard was just talking about has like $800 million just for
81 million a year.
For Tony Blair. Like, I mean, it's just patronage at an unbelievable level that the right is unwilling to accept or do anything with.
Well, and the problem is, the issue is with the right, is that it's stiff a lot of the time, it's boring. You just see them and you just go, you may make some good points, mate, but you're 23, why are you wearing a tweed jacket? Why? Maybe just go out and do some ketamine, come back in 5 years and we can have a conversation.
I 100% agree.
Have some interesting experiences. It's great you want to start a family and you're 16, but maybe just go out and live a bit, And that's the problem, is that with the right, it's just, they just take themselves too seriously. It's a problem with the far left as well. Like, they just take themselves too seriously. They're these miserable, people who just sit in the corner of rooms with no joy and no play. And what the right needs to do is just have a bit of fun.
Yeah.
What is a right-wing drug? Cocaine. And that makes you just even more serious than you were.
The world's most boring drug.
Yeah. You don't play with cocaine. You're just like, I'm fucking great and everything needs to be more like this.
Yeah.
I'm just saying people on the right drop some acid.
That's the solution to our...
Yeah, do psychedelics, man.
Yeah.
I don't disagree.
Yeah, I don't agree.
Have you done psychedelics?
I've never done it.
How can you disagree?
Never really done any drugs, but I find myself...
Stay tuned for our special episode.
I find myself reasonably interesting. But yeah.
You see, even that you've caveated. I find myself reasonably interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm joking. But I do think that... I think the right is getting a little bit better, actually, at leaning into irreverence as a virtue. And one thing that I like about... I don't know whether... I think that I have... speaking personally, I have a pretty strong contrarian instinct. So, I mean, I grew up in Brighton.
Wow.
I think that partly explains why I'm so, conservative about things. I think if I'd been grown up in Shire country, I'd be some fire-breathing Trotskyist in all likelihood. Because
you could be a woman. I don't know.
I react against my environment. But one thing I like about being a conservative in the current political dispensation is that there is room to be, irreverent. There is room to be rebellious, and it means that you can add the thrill of transgression to the importance of defending something that you do truly love. So you've got the healthy conserving instincts, which I think animates conservatism, mixed in with a bit of mischief, and I quite like that. And I wonder whether you're partly right in thinking that while we shouldn't ditch all of the values that we care about, we should be willing to present in the public sphere with a smile on our face a little bit more, and enjoy the satirical aspect of being on the right in the current condition.
Yeah, you should do. Yeah. You should stop taking it so seriously. Look, we know the West is going down the toilet. Can we not just have a bit of a laugh about it for once?
Yes.
Does it have to be everybody po-faced sitting round the table going, the West is going down the toilet and I'm worried about our cultural values? We all know it's going down the shitter. Can we just at least have a little bit of levity every now and again?
Yeah, I think the epidemic of people in their early 20s who only know politics and have no other hobbies or anything.
Get laid.
I know, it's getting a bit brutal. I do think a bit of this is a bit more English, though. I think the US is a little bit lighter on it, and there is a little bit more kind of avant-garde, quote-unquote, right-wing things. I think the UK needs to catch up in a big way.
I really agree with you, but I think part of that, look, I think the right in America, I don't really like the hardline Christian right. I think I find them deeply troubling in many ways. Not all of them. There's some who are very nice, and I know them personally, they're friends, yada, yada, yada. But there's parts of them I'm like, But one thing I do like, actually, and one thing that the American right benefits from, is the mental libertarian right.
Sure.
You know the nutbag libertarian who's just like, there should be no law. We should just basically And look, those people are nuts. God bless them. But what I actually quite like about them is they actually bring a freedom of thought to the right that in many ways we don't have in the UK, where the right is actually quite constrained. And I like that nuttiness that they bring, which we don't seem to have here. And I think the right needs. That's
interesting. And a lot of... One thing that I was particularly... I don't know where you stood on the whole COVID panic situation. I mean,
a massive, force vaccine. Let's just fucking jab you up, mate. Let's just get it right in there.
But I do find it interesting that a lot of people, including me, I did kind of expect that the Anglo-Saxon love of liberty would kick in, and the British people wouldn't put up with this level of social engineering, precisely because in America there is a little bit more in the way of that "don't tread on me" spirit. That sort of libertarian mindset. I'm self-sufficient and all the rest of it. It's interesting that didn't completely take over America in the way that it did take over countries like Britain. Yeah,
it did. And what I find interesting, of course, the left went mental with it. Of course, they did, and locking down harder, faster. Six injections up the arse and all the rest of it. But this is what the right don't want to acknowledge. Is there was a large age component to this.
Massive.
Mm-hmm.
And if you spoke, I did an interview with David Starkey, and I really admire David. I think he's a wonderful historian and he has a first-class brain. But he was pretty hard line on COVID injections on the old vaccines, and the reason is because he's an old man, and COVID. If he gets COVID, it is likely to be very serious for him. In the same way that Chomsky, in the words of Jimmy Dore, lost his mind when we interviewed him on the pod.
You had Chomsky on the pod?
No, we had Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore talking
Great
about
as well.
who's a dissident lefty and part of that group.
I see.
He was talking about Chomsky losing his mind about it. So the problem is, and this is one of the real issues that we have with the culture war, is that it's a war. And the first victim of all war, as we all know, is truth. And so what happens is everybody presenting their side of what the truth is, but within that, we lose sight of the actual truth, and we get it with everything. We get it with Brexit. We get it with the trans debate or whatever else, and blah 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 blah. And the right ignored the fact that there was a lot of old-fashioned social conservatives who many of their views I actually find very admirable, who actually came out and were very hard line about it.
We should not forget the fact that it was all the right-wingers in the early days who were saying lockdown, masks, control, and then it did kind of flip. I still don't really understand why.
That was more true in America, I think, than it was here. So
Really?
so it was really interesting. In many ways, Trump, as your sort of archetypal psychological conservative, loves borders, loves controls, all these sorts of things, like protect the integrity of the nation, all this sort of conservative messaging, he could have used COVID very much to his advantage. And it's interesting that one of the things that Nancy Pelosi made a deliberate point of doing in LA, I think she went to Chinatown. She went to Chinatown to show solidarity with anyone implying that this is some kind of like Asian, Chinese virus invasion and all the rest of it. And a lot of people, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that one of the reasons why Trump didn't, get over the line in many key swing states was partly because older voters who would normally have voted for him had died, and also because they were also pretty dismayed about how they perceived he had mishandled the pandemic, even though the president has very little power to be. A lot of it is devolved to governors in any case. So you're right. The COVID thing wasn't neat in the way that it cut across ideological lines. It was much more neat in terms of demographics.
Trump has only recently gone back on his vaccine kind of rhetoric too. Like only in the last few weeks. Up until he was at war with his base for like 2 years. We're saying like, no, the vaccines are great. Operation Warp Speed, I'm the best, and it's interesting. This is, I think, maybe the first time I can ever think of Trump like kind of walking back on something. Where he's now realized that the American right is like so opposed to this that even though he thought it would be like this big feather in his cap, he's now trying to like tar like DeSantis. It's like, oh, you actually wanted lockdowns of vaccines.
And it's also as well, and this goes to both sides of it. We also forget how terrifying COVID was. It's very easy now sitting here, however many years down the line, going, well, we locked down too fast, too quick, first lockdown. Actually, when it first came out, a lot of I was worried. You looked at what happened. I think it was in Perugia, was it? In Italy? And they showed the footage. We were all like, holy.
I remember February 2020, because the lockdowns in Canada happened in March 14th.
But I think it was around about the same time as us. I think
March
23rd.
But
it was in March 23rd.
I remember in February, like watching videos of like people getting like JB welded into their homes in China, and like talking to my roommates at the times and being like, "You do realize that's like an 8-hour flight away? Like this could be something very interesting. Like we might want to like take notice of what's going on in China." And they're like, "Oh, Evan, like you're trying to scare us. Like you don't need to worry about this. Like stop being such a conspiracy theorist." And 2 months later, not even 2 months. 4 months later, once we had good data kind of in the West and we knew like it's old people and it's sick people and everybody's more or less going to get it and it's okay. And I was like, let's kind of go back out and like live our lives again. They had totally flipped to now thinking it was like the most dangerous thing that had ever happened or will ever happen. And they thought I was once again a conspiracy theorist for having the opinion that they had 4 months ago.
No, this is true, but I certainly think that there shouldn't be too much of that. I do slightly disagree with you. I mean, there were a lot of people, and like I wasn't very public at that time, but I was against it from the beginning, and there were lots of people who were publicly against it from the beginning. And one of the reasons why we have statesmen, and one of the reasons why statesmen elect to become statesmen, is precisely because they don't get dragged up in understandable public panic. I mean, when there are conditions of radical uncertainty, obviously the public is going to be incredibly concerned. There are pictures coming in from Italy, China. We don't know about how this breaks down in terms of how lethal it is. But statesmen exist to navigate that situation, not to get swept up in it. And that is very clearly what happened. We had a plan which made sense and which was the fruit of 10 years worth of pre-pandemic planning. Anyone who's interested, it's only about 75 pages. You can read the 2011.
They won't.
If you want to, though, you can read the pandemic preparedness plan, and it mentions absolutely nothing about lockdowns. Lockdowns were completely experimental, so you can't be ultra cautious about the virus itself, and then not apply that same caution to your own preferred medicine for dealing with the virus. You should be if you're going to exercise the precautionary principle, you should do it for everything, not just for the virus and not for your own wacky ideas about how to tame it. You should be cautious in every direction. And that's why we have leaders.
Well, look, I completely agree. And looking back with the benefit of hindsight, and I can't remember his name, Neil, whatever his name, Niall Ferguson, Neil Ferguson, Niall Ferguson, whatever his name is. And in an interview in the Times, he said, watching China made us realise what was possible. And you go, unless you're talking about food, mate, I don't think you should be following China in any shape or form.
Yes.
So why are you looking at what is possible and Jeremy Hunt eulogising China?
Massively.
Trudeau did it in Canada.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
He was doing it in 2013.
Is he gay? Let's talk about this. Because he's not going to sue you, and if he does, I've done you a massive favour.
I will go on the record of saying I do think Trudeau is gay, and also Castro's son. But I've heard that he's just a swinger. Anyway, he's gotten divorced, so I'm sure it'll all come out.
Did you see the picture of him at the Barbie?
Yeah.
That is his son.
No,
it's even worse.
But he came out and he looked like he was on coke and about to dive headfirst into a field of cocks. I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
Virtue signaling is his cocaine.
Yeah,
that's his high.
Yes.
I know, but I also think looking at him, he looked like he was about to get stuck in, to use a South London parlance.
Well, he's a former semi-professional drama teacher and snowboarder, and then he became prime minister. And you can find all these little different pictures of him online, and all these different outfits, dressing up as a cowboy and as a lumberjack and as an Indian man. And it's just I really do think he got into the office so that he could play dress up as he kind of flies all around the world.
Indeed.
It's a bit bizarre. Yeah.
It is a bit bizarre.
I'm not a fan.
No, I'm not.
You're a refugee from the land.
I'm literally a Canadian refugee. Yeah.
Yes.
And again, I don't care if he is, but when I look at him, there is something so completely disingenuous, literally about everything.
Well, he's lying about who his dad is.
Yeah.
Do you think he is?
Yeah. Maybe he doesn't know, but one thing that's for sure, he looks absolutely nothing like Pierre Trudeau.
No,
and he looks quite a little bit like Castro.
Pierre has another son.
Does it?
Who looks exactly like him.
The plot thickens.
I know, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Really,
this is a whole other episode.
This is my one big theory.
This is a whole other
episode. I'll die on
episode.
this hill.
Have you ever seen the interview with Matthew Perry where he talks about knowing Justin Trudeau?
No. The Friends actor.
Yeah. And I was always ambivalent to him, and I was always thought he was a little bit whiny. And then he said in the interview how he beat him up.
Really?
Yeah, Trudeau accuses him of beating him up. And I'm like, actually, you're all right, mate.
Yeah.
Well, Francis, it's been very interesting. You said we should be more interesting, and even at the risk of getting us sued, perhaps. Yeah, but it's been worthwhile, and thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you for coming on to Deprogrammed. Evan, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you wish, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.